Howdy. A few years ago, there were, the main thing I recall is wristbands, but items that would display WWJD, what would Jesus do, as a way of reminding Christians or Christians reminding themselves to stop and think about what it is they were doing or saying or thinking in the context of what Jesus would do. And the primary answer, the only answer I think that is fully accurate in that context, is Jesus would do what God wanted Jesus to do. And so those who wore that wristband needed to think not what would Jesus do if he were in their situation, but what would God have them do in that situation, in the same way Jesus would want to know what God would have Jesus do if he were in that situation. The point being, in part, that each of us has to answer to God for how, in fact, we behave in any given situation. As Jesus tells Peter in the final verses or near the final verses in the book of John, chapter 21, uh, that Peter needs to worry about himself and not about John when it comes to what Jesus would have John do. And that's an issue that can be a challenge at times as we try to live as Christians in community and we try to understand what individually we ought to do. And particularly when it comes to the Christian testimony, when it comes to being in a democracy. I think one of the tragedies of the success of democracy in America and in the 20th and 21st centuries has been the blurring of the line between what the message of the gospel is and what the message of democracy is. And I think that when it comes to this issue of who we ought to vote for, we sometimes presume upon others an idea about who they ought to vote for based on our belief as to what Jesus would do. But I would suggest that Jesus wouldn't vote. I would suggest that the message of Jesus, delivered in a time when citizens and inhabitants of the empire, most of whom were not citizens, had absolutely no say in politics, that Jesus was not concerned with what the earthly governments were doing. In various places, you see that God is in control and no government is instituted apart from God's will. And elsewhere, you see that Satan is actually in control in the sense that he can offer the kingdoms of the earth to Jesus if Jesus would simply kneel down to him. But the main point is that Jesus' concern was not about this earth. Jesus' concern was about people's relationship to God as framed in this earth for what that meant for eternity. And so, as Christians, as people who believe that there is a way that is best to vote, it's important to keep in mind, I think, that our vote as citizens in the United States of America is an expression of civil duty and civil obligation. That people aren't more or less Christian if they decide to vote or not to vote, or if they vote for one candidate over another, but it's everybody seeking with the intent of being faithful to God and to their understanding of what God would want in any given situation, to cast a vote for the myriad reasons that we have for casting votes. So I encourage all of us as we head into this election, particularly the Christian community, to keep in mind that in a time as contentious as this, the greatest testimony to what really matters is not the vote we cast or who, in fact, ends up being president of the United States, but how we as citizens, how we as Christians actually come together before and after the vote to bear testimony to what we want to say is most important. Thank you all very much. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Bye bye. Thank you very much for your time. I've got a couple other videos listed here if you'd like to take a look at those. And as I'd like to discuss issues related to politics, religion, society, and how in the world we're supposed to understand ourselves and life in the world. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye bye.